When we started preparing this presentation about 5,000 years of innovation, we had to ask the question, why Monroe? Why the ArkLaMiss? And what you may not realize is that Monroe is at the center of a trading area that's been historically significant for a very long time. We think of it as having significance for at least the last couple of hundred years as a trading area. But the significance of Monroe as the center of a trading network actually expands way back into history. And we're going to talk about that a little bit as we go tonight. So we're going to focus beyond Monroe a little bit to what we call the ArkLaMiss. Those of you in the room are familiar with this phrase. It's where the states of Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi meet. We're going to define it a little more granularly as the area from the mouth of the Arkansas River where it empties into the Mississippi down to Natchez, east about halfway to Jackson, Mississippi, and then over to Ruston, Louisiana. So we'd incorporate El Dorado and Camden, Arkansas, and some places like that. Some of the innovations that we'll talk about tonight are very familiar to you if you grew up in the area, but for those of you out in TED.org land, you may not be aware that the first time Coca-Cola was bottled was in Vicksburg, Mississippi in the mid-1890s by Joe Biedenharn. And this was important because before this, Coca-Cola was served in pharmacies and distribution was a challenge. So by bottling the beverage, it led to an innovation in distribution that culminated in one of the most recognizable brands in the world. Delta Airlines, again, some of these familiar to you, but for those of you out on the internet watching this, Delta Airlines started as a crop dusting service in Monroe in the mid-1920s, expanded into mail transportation and passenger traffic, and eventually moved to Atlanta, where it expanded into what's ultimately now one of the largest airlines in the world. CenturyLink, one of our corporate sponsors of the event tonight, now the third largest telephone company in the country, began in the front parlor of the founder's home. That switchboard was given to him as a wedding gift, and he expanded it into what's now a very significant enterprise with operations all over the world. There are other stories of companies that have emerged out of the ArkLaMiss region. There are a lot of famous sports figures and entertainers who have come from the region, but I wanted to focus on a few that you may not be aware are actually from the area. On the far left here is John Johnson, the founder of Ebony magazine. John Johnson was born and raised in Arkansas City, Arkansas, about 70 miles north of here. John went on to start a publishing empire, an insurance company, became the first African-American admitted to the Forbes 400 list, certainly broke through some barriers during his time growing up in the Delta. Johnny Cash and Bear Bryant grew up 8 miles apart in small towns in southeast Arkansas, went on to set records, sell records during their emergence from very impoverished backgrounds that they grew up in. On the far right is someone that you may not have heard of, Madam C.J. Walker. She was born Sarah Breedlove in 1867. The child of slaves who had recently been freed. She was born on a plantation in Delta, Louisiana, not far from here, right across the river from Vicksburg, Mississippi. And Madam C.J. Walker developed a line of hair care products that eventually grew into a very large enterprise based mostly out of St. Louis. She broke some significant barriers when she became the first self-made female millionaire in U.S. history before she could vote. This was in 1919. So certainly broke through some barriers. Charles Lindbergh is not from the area, but he did accomplish a first in the area. He made his first night flight and night landing in Lake Village, Arkansas in 1924. This was 4 years before he made the first transatlantic flight, and certainly would have contributed to his knowledge of flying at night to make that trip. The teddy bear, most of you recognize this symbol. You may or may not know the story behind the teddy bear when Teddy Roosevelt was here hunting in the area in the ArkLaMiss, and there is some argument about whether this was in Mississippi or Louisiana, but they weren't having a very good hunt, and he was in search of black bear specifically. So an enterprising guide tied up a small bear so that President Roosevelt could shoot the bear, and he refused to shoot it. And from that point forward, the teddy bear became historical. Some of the more pedestrian innovations from the area: the first time shoes were sold as a pair, left, right, in a box, was in Vicksburg, Mississippi in the mid-1890s. In the late 19th century, innovation in the ArkLaMiss was at the forefront of mainstream progress. And so some of the patents that we see filed from the area at the time, like this steam engine by Mr. H.F. Bain, filed in Ruston in the 1890s. The fertilizer distributor, patented by a gentleman here in Monroe in the 1870s. This baling press, which was patented by a gentleman in Rayville around the same time. This boring apparatus, important to drilling wells for what later became one of the most important natural gas and oil fields in North America, was patented by a gentleman in Farmerville in that time frame. One of the more interesting patents filed during this time period to me was by a gentleman named Charles McDermott. Mr. McDermott, Dr. McDermott, was a Yale-trained medical doctor. He grew up in New Orleans. He was the son of a prominent family there, the second son, so his older brother inherited all the land. He had to choose a profession. So he went to Yale, became a medical doctor. He went upriver and settled on a place right across from Greenville, Mississippi, which was a very important crossing of the river at the time. And he practiced medicine. He was a gentleman farmer, very Jeffersonian character. And he designed this flying machine in 1871, 30-plus years before, 1872, 30-plus years before the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk. Happens to be the town that I was born in, Dermot, Arkansas. This map has a lot of information embedded in it, and as we go back in history a little further, this was how Europeans viewed North America in the mid-18th century. So you can see this big ocean in the middle of the Pacific Northwest that we now know doesn't exist. Europeans had good information, good data points about the edges of the continent from explorers and records that have been kept, but they really knew very little about the interior. And the Louisiana Territory, what became the Louisiana Purchase, really was the first land of opportunity. It was the Silicon Valley of its day, in a way. There was a lot of opportunity there. So this map was informed by those data points from explorers, but also by legend and lore from Native Americans, other explorers, folks who had settled in the area. Hernando de Soto informed this map from his expeditions 200 years before it was printed, and he was, legend has it, he died and was buried in Lake Chico, Arkansas, which is just about 70 miles north of here, 65 miles north of here. A man by the name of Moncache de Pay, a Yazoo Indian from Natchez, Mississippi in 1700, about 1700, actually walked from Natchez to the Pacific Ocean and back, and then later documented his journey through interviews with a French entrepreneur who was living in Natchez at the time. Now, this was 100 years before the Lewis and Clark expedition. A copy of that French interview with that explorer was in Thomas Jefferson's library when he bought Louisiana from Napoleon. And it accompanied Lewis and Clark on their expedition and informed a lot of their travels as they went out west. And what allowed Moncache de Pay to do this 100 years before Lewis and Clark was that he was the descendant of a culture that had evolved over thousands of years in this area, a trading network that expanded from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, from the Carolinas all the way out to the Rocky Mountains. So it wasn't as challenging as you might have thought. He would travel from one village to the next. In the first village, he would learn the language of the next village and then move on to the next village from there and do it sequentially. He found out that Sea of the West did not exist as he walked past it and there wasn't water there. He informed the French interviewer of that fact, but he left it on anyway, because without that ocean being there, the French king was not going to fund expeditions to go west. There were tools, there were innovations in pottery. They added seashells to pottery to temper it, to make them last longer, to make them stronger, to make them fire it at higher temperatures. But their greatest innovation was in creating a society and a culture that allowed them to coexist peacefully, but to manage a very sprawling enterprise, which covered really the entire Mississippi River Valley at various points. And Jenny's going to talk a bit about that culture and what she's encountered in her exploration of local mounds.
So the first time I went to New York City, I was in my 20s, and I went to the Metropolitan Museum, and I went to the Egyptian wing first, and I got stuck there. I ended up spending the whole rest of the day in the Egyptian wing. I was completely fascinated by all of the old ancient artifacts that they had in these glass cases. Now, I'd seen these photos or read in textbooks about them, but to stand in front of them and have nothing between me and them but some glass was fascinating to me. So all these years later, imagine how fascinated I am now to be able to stand on or next to an ancient earthwork that was built before most of those Egyptian artifacts were made, before the pyramids were built in Egypt, before Stonehenge. This ancient earthwork is about an hour's drive from here. It was built between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago from good old Louisiana dirt, basket by basket by basket. And it is just standing in the middle of farmland. When I took this photograph, there was a cotton field all the way around it. There are over 700 of these mound sites in Louisiana with a really high concentration here in northeastern Louisiana. We have some of the oldest earthworks any place in North America. So I got interested in trying to find these earthworks. Where were they? So I met with archaeologists, and they started taking me to these sites. Most of them are on private property. There aren't any laws to protect them. They're not tourist destinations. They are not celebrated. So we had to go out and find them, and they had to introduce me to these landowners to try to get permission to actually take these photographs. And I have found these all over the place. They are along just dusty dirt roads, sandwiched between cornfields with a big ancient mound as a sort of traffic circle. Or they are deep in the woods, secluded, sort of like this ancient sacred cathedral in the middle of nowhere. Some of them are in the middle of town. This is in Tallulah, Louisiana, and it actually has a house built on top of it. And this house has a cellar, which is rare in Louisiana, and this cellar goes all the way down inside this earthwork. They have cemeteries built on top of them. They have tool sheds built on top of them. What better place to store your farm equipment than on top of an ancient earthwork? Some of them, granted, are not very, very big, and they can be completely bare. Some of them are quite tall and quite steep and covered in vines and debris and tree limbs and poison ivy and snakes. So they're literally all over the place. There is one site that is open to the public, and that's Poverty Point, which is about an hour's drive from here. And when it was active, it was the largest city in North America. It was New York City. It was the place to be. I know people who go out there, people in this room that I've talked to tonight, who said, this place is boring. There's nothing there but some piles of dirt. And I think if you go there and you just drive around and drive back home, then you're probably just not going to see anything but piles of dirt. This is a topographic map of what the site looks like today. You can see the mounds, you can see the earth ridges, you can see the open plaza in the center. So this was a fairly big city. And if you go to the site and you go in the museum and you get out of your car and walk around a little bit, watch there's a little short film, look at the artifacts in the glass cases, and really get out and walk on foot. You'll start to feel the size of this place, and you'll start to feel the people who built it. And they were just hunter-gatherers and fishers. They had a ton of work to do just to put food on the table. just to have the basic necessities. And they had to build this huge city out of dirt. They also had to truck in, without trucks, raw materials. Poverty Point doesn't have really anything in the way of rock, which was absolutely necessary. So they set up these major trading networks all the way as far as Georgia and the Great Lakes. And this was before Google, where you could find where to go, or eBay just to order it and have it sent to you. And there are over 70 metric tons of rock at Poverty Point that's been brought in from someplace else. They also have fake rocks, and they made those out of clay. This is what they call a Poverty Point object, a PPO, and they would heat these and use them for cooking. And this is an actual artifact, 3,500-year-old artifact from Poverty Point. With all of the work they had to do, they also found time to create art. These little owls are made out of stone and about the size of my thumbnail. They would make faces and torsos out of fired clay. And they would make just decorative objects that had no purpose other than being decorative or symbolic. So with all the work they had to do, they also knew the importance of creating art, and they found time to do that. Standing on top of one of these mounds can be absolutely magical. I can stand on top of here and close my eyes and imagine all that clutter is gone and see these people down below just living their lives, creating all this stuff and dropping it on the ground and leaving it. And I've reached down at some of these sites and picked up what looks like just nondescript gravel. But it's not. It's fire-cracked rock. It's rock that would have been heated and used to cook food and left on the ground. And I've picked it up and held it, knowing that the last person to touch it probably did so 6,000 years ago. And I feel so connected to these people and can start to imagine this timeline that stretches from a 6,000-year-old mound to Poverty Point to them learning about agriculture and irrigation and all the things that Chris mentioned, all the way up to where we're sitting here today. And I think my spot on that timeline is minuscule. And I feel insignificant and small. You sit on this giant earthwork and you think about our culture today and we think we're so smart. But what if all those things that Chris mentioned are even still here today? Even the glass Coke bottle is plastic now. So I wonder, what are we leaving behind? What are people going to find on the ground from us? What are they going to reach down and pick up and hold in their hand and say, that's who these people were? And what are they going to think about the way we're treating their planet? I hope that we can find a way to keep these ancient mounds safe so that future generations can stand on them and feel their connection to us and feel their connection to the people who built these places. And I hope that after spending a few minutes with these mounds, that you'll appreciate them a little bit more. And the next time you see some big pile of dirt in the middle of nowhere, or pick up a rock off the ground, to remember that, like most things in life, not everything is as it first seems. Sometimes you have to get out of the car and walk around a little bit to be able to see below the surface. Thank you.